Hello everyone, and welcome to Wallingford Public Library's Part 2 of Women in American History. In this 4-part series, presenter Mark Albertson is featuring 4 pioneering women for their contributions to America in the 19th and 20th centuries. And tonight, he'll be talking about Helen Keller, who was born in 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama. And she lost her sight and her hearing at age 19 months. She was a determined individual who made positive contributions to humanity by showing that physical disabilities could be overcome. She traveled to 40 nations throughout her lifetime, conveying her message, and she became an inspiration by her own example. So please help me welcome Mark Albertson.
Good evening. Good evening. Yeah, this this series, it's too bad I'm only doing 4. There's a lot of ladies we could do, but I thought I'd try to pick 4 that stand out in whatever they were doing, at the same time raising the stature of women here at the time, the 19th into the 20th centuries. And last time I was here, I did Susan B. Anthony, who was a marvelous individual. And now Helen Keller, who actually appears a little later on the scene here, although they will cross paths because Helen Keller will be born June 27, 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama. And her father, Arthur Keller, is interesting. He was the editor of the North Alabamian, hardly the New York Times, but he was the editor of this paper. He was also a captain at one point in the Confederate Army. Her mother, Helen Keller's mother, Kate Adams Keller, that family was from Massachusetts. And her father, Charles, was actually a colonel in the Confederate Army, though he was from Massachusetts. Later breveted to become a brigadier general. And her paternal grandmother was actually a relative to Robert E. Lee. A lot going on here. And she was also a descendant of part of the family. The part of the family background is Swiss, and she had an ancestor who actually took care of deaf people in Switzerland. Well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree here in certain respects. However, as was previously mentioned, she was born with eyesight and the ability to hear. However, when she's 18 or 19 months, she does suffer severe stomach and brain ailments, which some doctors seem to think either led to meningitis and or scarlet fever. And it robbed her of her sight and her hearing. However, living with the Keller family was a housekeeper. Last name was Washington. She was a housekeeper, cook, so on and so forth. And she had a daughter. Name was Martha. And Martha was like 5 or 6 years old. But it's interesting how the human condition acclimates itself to such drawbacks. And so Helen Keller and Martha Washington, even though Helen Keller isn't even quite 2 years old yet, is finding ways to communicate with Martha. Helen Keller develops this uncanny knack, even though she can't see and can't hear, to detect footfalls or footsteps. She could detect if you walked into a room whether you were a male or a female. She could detect after a while whether you were young or you were old. She could detect after a while, it's familiarity here, if she knew you by your footfalls or your footsteps. You know, this brings up, and I bring this up now, Gore Vidal, the playwright. Remember him? He was a grandson to Senator Gore from Oklahoma, the blind senator. And he was excited as a child to tell his grandfather, gee, radar, this is great. You can bounce radio waves off another object and it comes back and tells you how far you are. And his grandfather says, I don't see what the big deal is. Blind people knew about radar for a long time. Well, how's that? Well, if you close your eyes and you walk slowly across a room, eventually the sound of your footsteps are going to bounce off the wall. You know there's an obstruction here. Yeah.
Also click.
Well, okay. But again, you're relying on your other sense, in this case hearing, to pick up a sound. But of course, if you're blind and deaf, that's a different story. But these other senses become more acute. And so she begins to develop the sense of touch here as well. And she had a very light touch. In fact, later on, with machines that play music, she used to be able to put her fingertips on a tabletop or a desktop and detect the vibrations made by the music. She began to enjoy music this way. And later on, obviously she's going to get into Braille, I don't have to tell you that, but she would take one of her fingers and put it up against your lips if you were talking, and that's how she understood what you were saying. Yeah, that's amazing how this is going on. However, when she's 6 years old, her mother, Kate, had read a book by Dickens. And this book, interestingly enough, was called, I have it here, where do I have it here? Book was called American Notes. And in the book is Laura Bridgman, who was blind and who was deaf. This lady was successfully educated. Well, now Kate gets the idea here. And so Arthur will take young Helen to an eye, ear, and nose specialist in Baltimore, known as J. Julian Chisholm. He, in turn, he checks her out, but sends her to somebody else who is getting into studying people who are deaf and who are blind. Alexander Graham Bell. He, in turn, will send her to the Perkins Institute for the Blind. And it is there she's going to meet a man, they're both going to meet a man named Michael Agnanos, who's going to take a look at Helen and then assign a young lady to help Helen at this point. And she's a 20-year-old young lady, and this will begin a 49-year relationship between the two. It's Ann Sullivan. Ann Sullivan. And the first thing Ann Sullivan does, now keep in mind in the beginning here, this is a rocky start. I mean, you're dealing with somebody who's going to be 7 years old, because Ann Sullivan's going to move into the Keller family household by March 1887. So Helen Keller is only 7 years old. I mean, you're dealing with somebody now who's getting a little older and understands she doesn't have all of what the other children have. It's going to be a tough road to hoe. But Ann Sullivan gives her a doll. Now, it's nice to be polite. This is the beginning of therapy here. A doll. Well, how do you spell doll? Take your finger, take an open hand, D. O-L-L. She's beginning to teach Helen Keller how to spell. She also teaches Helen Keller how to spell, but at the same time, understand her world surroundings. Water. Turning the water on, putting her hands in the water. Rubbing your hands in the water, you're now beginning to get some idea of what water is. Well, this opens up the spigots, obviously, here. How do you spell cat? How do you spell dog? How do you spell mug? In fact, again, developing this talent for touch, she becomes acquainted with animals. For like a dog and a cat, she would run her hands from the nose down the animal's body to the tail. Well, this is a dog, this is a cat, whatever the case may be. And so this education process begins, but it's not an easy road here. However, by 1888, she's back at the Perkins Institute for the Blind. This is up in South Boston. And she will be here with Ann Sullivan until 1894. The Sullivan and Helen Keller moved to New York. It's here she attends the Wright Humanin School for the Deaf. She will later go to the Horace Mann School for the Deaf. And by 1896, she's back in Massachusetts, going to the Cambridge School for Young Ladies. And Ann Sullivan, for the most part, is with her along the way here. However, in 1900, when she's finished with the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, she attends Radcliffe College. And of course, one of her friends here, already an admirer, because keep in mind, Helen Keller has already written a book at age 11 called The Frost King. And I'll get into that as we go on here. And so one of her admirers is Mark Twain. Mark Twain introduces her to a Henry Huddleston Rogers. And Henry Huddleston Rogers is an executive with Standard Oil. He and his wife, Abby, will foot the tuition bill. All she's got to do is go to school. Still a tough road to hoe. She'll graduate in 1904. She's 24 years old with a bachelor's degree in the arts. She's the first one to do this. Now keep in mind as we go along here in 1904, when you're now in the 20th century, she's 24 years old. She's beginning to become a speaker. And she's also has a relationship with a Wilhelm Jerusalem, and an Austrian philosopher who early on saw her literary talent, and she's still corresponding with him because she's beginning to, put things down in a literary fashion here as she begins to learn how to speak. Interesting, in 1916, she goes to Menominee, Wisconsin, and she gives this talk in Menominee, Wisconsin. And this talk really strikes the people who went to this talk. It's a talk of hope, togetherness, working with each other. Let's have an affinity for each other. And this talk really draws in people who saw this talk and heard this talk. In fact, in January 2016, newspapers there reprinted the speech on the 100th anniversary of this speech. Interesting some of what she says here. Now, the person who compiled this from the files and had it republished in the newspapers, according to those who attended, Helen Keller spoke of the joy that life gave her. She was thankful for the faculties and abilities that she did possess, and stated that the most productive pleasures she had, these are the two talents that really buttressed this lady: curiosity and imagination. That's what she says. Interesting. Keller also spoke of the joy of service and happiness that comes from doing things for others. Boy, that's missing today. Especially in the current political climate, I guess. I wonder what she'd say if she was around today. Keller imparted that helping your fellow man were one's only excuse for being in this world. And in doing things to help others, one's other fellows, lay the secret for lasting happiness. She also told of the joys of loving work and accomplishment and the happiness of achievement. Although the entire lecture lasted only a little over an hour, the lecture had a profound impact on the audience. So this lady is overcoming not only blindness and deafness, but dumbness. Well, this lady's a mover and a shaker, I'll tell you that. However, by this time, 1905, we'll go going back a few years, Ann Sullivan had married a gentleman by the name of John Macy. Now it's Macy, Sullivan, and Helen Keller. But by 1914, Ann Sullivan is beginning to be sick. And they will hire another lady for the entourage, Polly Thompson. This is a Scottish lady who was supposed to keep house and cook, who had no previous experience with people who were blind or deaf. Yet she would eventually become Helen Keller's secretary. And Polly Thompson will be with her until she in turn herself dies. Polly Thompson will later have a stroke in 1957, and they'll bring another lady on called Winnie Corbally, who will attend to not only Helen Keller, but also attend to Polly Thompson. And when Polly Thompson dies in 1960, Winnie Corbally will remain with Helen Keller for the rest of her life. And and by the way, at one point when Ann Sullivan becomes sick and they take on Polly Thompson, they also have a temporary editor that will move in too. Peter Fagan of the Boston Herald. And the two will develop, Helen Keller and Peter Fagan will briefly be in love. It won't work out. Peter Fagan will eventually, go back to the Boston Herald, but Helen Keller will remain with Ann Sullivan. Ann Sullivan will die in 1936 with Helen Keller holding her hand as she dies. They were together 49 years, but then Polly Thompson remains. However, political, and I want to get into this a little bit. This is usually left out when they talk about Helen Keller, her political activities. This was a lady who was not shy about being an unabashed socialist. She was actually a vehement pacifist, anti-war. She was also an opponent of Woodrow Wilson. Because Woodrow Wilson's going to ask for that declaration of war April 2nd, 1917, and he'll get it from Congress April 6th, 1917. We get into a war. She was obviously good friends here with Mark Twain, whose politics were rather radical at the time too, and that's kind of overlooked with Mark Twain as well. But Helen Keller here was not only pushing the causes of people who had impairments, deafness, blindness, dumbness. She was also a social activist, suffragette. Keep in mind, she'll see the women get the right to vote, 1920. She was also in the trenches on this. But she will really fight the socialist cause, especially between 1909 and 1921. In fact, she will join the International Workers of the World, or known as the Wobblies, in 1912. And she will also be one of the founding members of the American Civil Liberties Union in 1920. Yeah. And she, as a member of the Socialist Party, she will also help in the campaigns for Eugene Debs. I mean, keep in mind, there were a number of elections going back in those days. It wasn't just the two-party system. There were third-party candidates running here, and some of these were, guys like Eugene Debs, although he'll never make it to the White House, you know that, but he ran anyway. Socialism was becoming fairly popular here, not only in Europe, but to a certain extent here. But she actually says something here which is interesting. And this is Helen Keller in 1911. The few own the many because they possess the means of livelihood of all. The country is governed for the richest, for the corporations, the bankers, the land speculators, and for the exploiters of labor. Unlike Hillary Clinton, I don't think she'd get an audience at Goldman Sachs. The majority of mankind are working people. So long as their fair demands, the ownership and control of their livelihoods are set at naught, we can neither have men's rights, neither women's rights. The majority of mankind is ground down by industrial oppression in order that the small remnant may live in ease. And that's Helen Keller in 1911. However, she found something else out too. There was a lot of sympathy for this lady. But as soon as she announced she was a socialist, she began to see how she was regarded in a different fashion by some aspects of the press. Now, there was the Rockefeller-controlled press that didn't want to publish her anymore, and she threw a stink, and they finally did. However, interesting here what she claims, the Brooklyn Eagle. This is interesting. Keller claimed that the newspaper columnists who had praised her courage and intelligence before she expressed her socialist views now called attention to her disabilities. The editor of the Brooklyn Eagle wrote that, this is in quotes, mistakes sprung out of the manifest limitations of her development. Keller responded to the editor referring to him having met him before he knew of her political views. And she replies, "At the time, the compliments he paid me were so generous that I blushed to remember them. But now that I have come out for socialism, he reminds me in the public that I am blind and deaf and especially liable to error. I must have shrunk in intelligence during the years since I met him. Oh, ridiculous Brooklyn Eagle, socially blind and deaf." That's rather strong, isn't it? I get a kick out of it. This lady's blind and deaf, and she's railing all this off long before Noam Chomsky's even born here. Socially blind and deaf, it defends an intolerable system, a system that is the cause of much of the physical blindness and deafness which we are trying to prevent. This lady was a vehement opponent of the freewheeling industrialization going on, something we were talking about a little bit before. And interesting here because she also, with the help of a George Kessler in 1915, put together the Helen Keller International. Interesting organization that was doing research into health, nutrition, vision. She was convinced that proper nutrition was a requirement for health.
That's true.
How many of your doctors today are nutritionists? He's shaking his head no. Are a lot of them nutritionists? Not really, no. What do they prescribe? We'll take these pills, right? Yeah, right. And so here's a lady who's already thinking that good health is required, a requirement is nutrition. Interesting. She's also one, and again, this is fascinating too. When she says at one point, "I was appointed on a commission to investigate the conditions of the blind. For the first time, I thought that blindness a misfortune beyond human control. Found that too much of it was traceable to wrong industrial conditions, often caused by the selfishness and greed of employers." Remember that book, The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair?
Yeah.
Ever read that book? If you ever read that book, you won't eat a sausage again. Well, yeah, he was describing how in a fictional fashion through these characters, these immigrants working in a factory, meat packing factory, how they just sweep the scraps up off the floor and make the sausage with it. Off the concrete floor. I mean, these animals had already pooped and messed, and it's not very good here. Often caused by selfishness and greed of the employers, and the social evil contributed its share. I found that, get this, I found that poverty drove women to a life of shame that ended in blindness. This lady is talking around the fact that prostitution can lead to what? Syphilis? And what can syphilis lead to? Blindness. Go back. Nutrition. Eating well, living fairly well, keeps you healthy. She was also for birth control, by the way. And she was also one of those interested in eugenics. And so there's a lot going on here with this lady. I mean, it's fascinating. Interesting here that eugenics movement, sterilization. Do you know that our state was one of the first to okay that?
Yeah.
1909, I believe it was, with states like, I think, Virginia, Indiana, California.
Wasn't Lindbergh interested in that?
I'm not sure, but he could have been, yes.
Yeah. What do you call that? What word do you say now?
Sterilization.
We say?
Eugenics?
Well, eugenics, right, but sterilization,
Bell.
getting into that.
Bell was for it too.
Right, Alexander Graham Bell. But, I mean, fast forwarding for a moment to 1946, 47, 48, when some of these Nazis were being stood up at Nuremberg here, what was some of the defense? Well, the United States did it. The United States exterminated the Indians. Interesting how that is. Of course, the Nazis are going to put a sour face on eugenics. We know that. But again, this lady, what? But besides the fact she's still a champion here for people who are blind and deaf. She actually travels at one point to 25 different countries giving talks with Ann Sullivan. In the end, it'll be upwards of 40. Because after Ann Sullivan dies, she'll travel with Polly Thompson, and she will be, giving talks, also pump priming the American Federation for the Blind, which is a big thing with this lady. And so she's not only pushing the case for people who are blind and deaf, but almost a total social activist here. And she matures as she goes along. You know where else she was a hit? Japan. In the 1930s, they gave her one of those dogs, the Akita. She liked that dog. She thought it was a wonderful companion. Loyal, warm, loving, so on and so forth. Well, when the first dog that she got died, the Japanese government gave her another one. 1937, 1938. And keep in mind, this is the government that's invaded China. Interesting how that is. How a lady like this could break the ice with a government like that. A fascist government. But she will do a lot of traveling, and she will give a lot of talks. Unfortunately, she is of that era where some of her talks were recorded, and some of them are at the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA. Unfortunately, some of these records, and not just hers, were lost on 9/11 because NARA had some of its receptacle for records at the Twin Towers area. Yeah, that's a shame. That's a shame. That's really a shame. She was also here, and she says she was also interested in Henry George. He's an interesting character. He wrote a book called Progress and Poverty, and this helps push her towards socialism. Commiserate with the world, nature. Boy, she sounds like some people today, doesn't she? I mean, she is ahead of the curve here. She really is. She was a writer. She will write some 12 books. However, a book that she wrote in 1891 called The Frost King, there were some allegations against that book. She wrote it. She's no more than 11 years old at this point. However, interesting here what is said. There were allegations that this story had been plagiarized by her from The Frost Fairies by Margaret Canby. But then again, supposedly research, keep in mind she's blind and deaf. The story was read to her, and they call it cryptomnesia. The story was in the back of her mind, and when she came up with her own story, obviously there were ideas from the original story but then again, she wasn't really frowned on for this, because she's only 11 years old.
Did Ann Sullivan have anything to do with that?
That I honestly don't know. But I'm sure Ann Sullivan must have helped her write this story at this point, because she's virtually the secretary here. She will write another book in 1903, The Story of My Life, which is her by age 21, her story up to this point. Keep in mind, this is a lady, and you can tell she's popular, this is a lady who's going to meet every president from Grover Cleveland and Lyndon B. Johnson. That's a lot of chief executives to be acquainted with. And she will write a book called The World I Live in 1908, giving readers an insight into how she felt about the world. And this will be followed in 1913 by a book called Out of the Dark. And I don't have this book, but I'm going to get this book. It's a series of essays on socialism, which she published in 1913. I mean, this is a busy lady here. This is a busy lady. However, as I mentioned earlier, Polly Thompson will suffer a stroke, and they have to take on Winnie Corbally to look after her and Helen Keller. And by 1960, Polly Thompson is dead. And so Winnie Corbally will stay with Helen Keller. However, in 1961, Helen Keller is going to suffer a stroke, and her health will begin to decline from here. However, President Lyndon B. Johnson will Lyndon B. Johnson will bestow on her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And in 1965, she will be feted with, it's interesting here too, in 1965, she will be accorded the National Women's Hall of Fame entry at the New York World's Fair. She will die June 1, 1968, Arcan Ridge in Easton, Connecticut here. And in 1971, she will be accorded membership into the Alabama State Hall of Fame. And then in 2015, she will be that first in class of inductees, 12 people into the Alabama Authors Hall of Fame, or Writers Hall of Fame. She's in the first class. This lady did a lot, and she's still quite well remembered. She will be on that Gallup poll in 1999 as one of the most influential Americans of the 20th century. And that's 31 years after her death. 31 years after her death. And so she's left her mark. She's a fascinating character. She really truly is. But again, I wanted to bring up the politics because that's usually avoided here when she's referred to. But it's part of her makeup. Part of her makeup perhaps as a social activist. Part of her makeup as someone who has a regard for her fellow human beings. Interesting here. Fascinating.
But you mentioned that prior to her coming out politically, a lot of the newspapers, if I understood you correctly, they were sympathetic to her,
Oh yeah,
her condition.
right.
But now that she showed sign of intelligence, the gloves came off. And it didn't matter
Yeah,
if she
yeah.
had those shortcomings
Yeah,
anymore.
but I guess in response to your question, I guess they weren't using 8-ounce fight gloves. They might have been using 16-ounce practice gloves. You can't, this is a lady who's popular, and even though she's blind and deaf and doing what she's doing, you really can't come down severely on her. You can't. That won't play well with the public if you want to sell newspapers. That won't play well. And so, in a way, if you want to say so, in a way, that ball is in her court. She can respond and not feel any heat. So, in a way, that's to her advantage. Doesn't speak well maybe for some of these editors, but hey, Yes.
I was going to ask you about the signs, the way they use the signs now for blind. I was wondering if that was started with her or it happened later. Because I know Ann Sullivan used the palm.
Finger in the palm, right.
But they have signs now, even in Connecticut when the governor.
Oh, the braille on the wall? Like when you go into a room?
Not so much that, no, just the signs. You know how they give talks and people are.
Oh, sign language?
Yeah.
Sign language?
Yeah, was that started with Helen Keller? Or where did
That I honestly don't know. That's a good question, but I honestly don't know. Honestly don't know.
How did she learn to speak, and what was the quality of her natural speech?
She took speech lessons. She was coached. Of course, she begins to understand the spoken word by doing this to somebody's mouth, and by the contortion of the lips, she knew what you were saying. But through coaching and therapy, she's able to speak. And at the same time, which I find fascinating too, because I put the two together, she's able to understand music she can't hear by feeling the vibration of the player and enjoying music. And so this is a person, she's typical of a person like this whose other senses come alive, especially when they're developed. Now, my father-in-law is a case in point. Of course, my father-in-law is not blind, but he was totally deaf in one ear at 14, and now he's 94. He's practically deaf now anyway, has a hearing aid. But his situation was a little different. Your parents, right? You tell the kids not to run around the house. Do they listen? I know I didn't. Mom's back is turned. Let's go. And so my father-in-law, when they were living in New Canaan, Italian family in New Canaan, and the house, the stairway going up was not all that wide. So he says, my brother and I, Lenny, were running up the stairs. He said, I was about 13, 14, and we bumped and we both fell. Well, Lenny had a pencil sticking out of his pocket. Yeah, and the pencil went into my father-in-law's ear and destroyed the eardrum. And my father-in-law said, all of a sudden my balance is off. He said, I felt like a Bowery drunk. And the pencil point broke off. So now he has the lead in his he's had that lead in his head for the last 80 years. Every once in a while he tells me or my wife, he says, well, I got to go upstairs and get the lead out. But at least he has a sense of humor. But he learned how to read lips. And you know, and they live with us. They can't live alone. And so when we're at the dinner table, my wife will say, Dad, you don't have to yell. I can read lips. Or, and it drives my mother-in-law nuts, when he goes to sleep, he sleeps on the good ear. So my mother-in-law, John, and he's sawing him off. Because he's got the hearing aid out. He can barely hear, but now he's sleeping on that ear. You know, and then it's... So... But they acclimate. I mean, they draw on other senses to do what they have to do. It's amazing. It's fun to watch. It's fun to watch, but it's amazing to see. Yes?
Do you know if any of her speeches have been archived online?
Now, that's a good question. I didn't for this, I didn't look for that.
You have to do it. I was just curious.
I'll bet you if you get into the National Archives and Records Administration, they have a lot of these things archived. In fact, you can go there, or I'm sure you've probably maybe gone to the Library of Congress, and they have those testimonies that they've done of veterans who were in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, so on and so forth. It's the same sort of thing. But the tragic part here is some of those records were lost on 9/11. But yeah, you can go to the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, and they can. In fact, Pittsfield, Mass, the airfield up Pittsfield, Mass, off Route 7. There's a repository there. That's one of them. But if you go there, you might be able to find some of the records, and that'll answer your question here about how her voice was. I honestly don't know. Yes.
Didn't Alexander Graham Bell, both of his parents deaf or something like that?
It could have been. I don't know that much about Alexander Graham Bell's parents, but he was interested at one point. He had an institute to research that. He was into a lot of things. He had an association that was interested in flight too, in the early 20th century. So he was interested in many things. Anybody else have any questions or comments about this young lady? Yes?
What do you think her IQ might have been to have achieved so much?
Well, she must have had a decent IQ to do this. One would, yeah, I would think this lady was not low on the intelligence quotient scale here. She couldn't have been to accomplish what she did. I mean, when you're able to master being able to publicly speak and go to upwards of 40 countries, you're pretty intelligent here. And maybe that accentuated her intelligence because she's using that gift. That's the greatest gift God gave you, was a brain. And she used it. So, again, this lady's pretty fascinating. It's pretty fascinating. I mean, she's an inspiration here. She really is. She truly is. But then again, so were these other ladies like Susan B. Anthony, Amelia Earhart, who I'm going to do next month. And then finally I'll do Eleanor Roosevelt. I mean, these are all ladies who are raising the stature of women here at a time that there were many changes going on in the world. You know, there's a lot of changes coming on here, and women are taking advantage of them. They are.
Patty Duke movie, right?
Yeah, that was one of them. There were a number of.
Is that it?
There was a number. The Miracle Worker. Yeah, with what was her name? Who was Anne Bancroft. Yeah, was.
Annie Sullivan.
Annie Sullivan, right? Yeah. That was a pretty good movie. But there were other productions done as well. But yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, we only scratched the surface here, but there's a lot going on here with this lady. Yes.
When did she move to East?
I think in the 1930s. So she was there for quite a while. Her and Her and Polly Thompson.
And why did they move there, you know?
That I honestly don't know. It's a nice area to go to. It's a nice area, and it's a good base to work out of. You're not far from Massachusetts, and you're not far from New York City, so it's easy. And it's country. It's just nice. In fact, there was a lady when I gave this talk in Weston, who this lady was 60, I think, 62, and she lived near there. And she said they would go up to the house, her and her other girlfriends, when they were small. And Winnie Corbally would come to the door. Oh, can we see Mrs. Keller? Can we see Helen Keller? Well, not right now. She's resting. But every once in a while.
Who was one of the
Yeah.
nurses for Helen Keller.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But every once in a while, these girls would be able to talk. And I said, "Wow, boy, you're ahead of the game." Yeah. I mean, as a little girl or a little boy, even. I mean, talk to Helen Keller at this stage. Wow. Yeah. I mean, that's. I mean, she's a walking history book. Yes.
Ann Sullivan, I think she was more outspoken, right? I read somewhere where she was arguing with Helen Keller's family over slavery.
Yeah, I didn't get into that. Maybe that's a separate talk. But, well, you know.
I'm just saying, I'm not trying to, all I'm trying to say is, did she mold Helen Keller's mind as far as, how can I say it? To disagree with the way things are, you know what I mean?
I'm not so sure she did that. You know, as Helen Keller is maturing here, you know, the teens, and she's beginning to find herself, she's developing that regard for her fellow man. And that's helped by her being blind and deaf, and at one point dumb. I don't like using that term, but you know, they use that term anyway. But she overcomes all three. And so having overcome all three, then maybe she can be a role model for others. She will be. And so she comes to have this regard for her fellow man, which is obviously at odds with slavery. And so, and again, when you throw in like her, Susan B. Anthony, or Harriet Tubman, again, these are ladies who were actually on the same page here, maybe in a different route, but on the same page. And Helen Keller's one of them. A regard, and that speech she gave in Menominee, Wisconsin, which was repeated in 2016 in some of the papers there, about having a regard for your fellow man, and we're on this earth to help our fellow man, so on and so forth. And which is why, one of the reasons why she develops as an ardent pacifist, vehement anti-war. And she will become a socialist because she thought that was the best way for us to solve our problems. So it comes with maturity too, and that intelligence that she had. I mean, you can't lack intelligence to begin to think like this. You have to have some sort of intelligence to do this, to a certain extent, anyway. Yes.
With all her work to help people with disabilities, I imagine she would cry terribly if she saw what was going on in our Capitol building with handicapped people being taken out, protesting the Medicare or the health care bill.
Well, I mean, keep in mind too that she will in the 30s she'll live to see things like Social Security come along, and so maybe back then she saw this promise of a better world at this point. You know, with the 1930s coming out of the ashes of a depression, that kind of thing. So maybe the world is going in the right direction. You know, but she'll die in 1968 at the height of. You know, I mean, she'll see the Tet Offensive. You know, and so, you know, where is the country going at this point on her when she's on her last legs, if you want to use that term? I mean, she's going to die on June 1st, 1968, anyway. And so, yeah, and so it's interesting what she saw. Interesting what she saw. I mean, it would be interesting to see her, like you say, her take on what's going on now. Be interesting if Eleanor Roosevelt was around right now. So, but they're not. So, we're left with their legacy. So.
What did she die from?
Well, the series of strokes, but she died in her sleep. And so I guess that's the way to go if you're going to go.
It's interesting. This is 1968. A lot of famous people die, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and she gets no recognition. You never hear a history show or anything.
No,
And
well-
that was the year Helen Keller died too.
Yeah, I mean, when you go back to, I mean, a lot of flash and splash gets people's attention. This lady dies in her sleep,
Yeah.
after all that she did. And yet,
It died violently. Yeah.
right, RFK is assassinated, King is
I
assassinated.
don't even recall, I don't recall her even being in Connecticut.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, the other two come out. Who remembers it? Who remembers the day she
Yeah.
died? Was it on television? Was it on the news?
Yeah,
don't
I mean,
remember.
you would think a day like that, June 1 might be remembered. June 1, simple, it's one letter, one number. But no, you're right. But the long-term aspects of her accomplishments are what really should be celebrated here. But again, she's one of these ladies who helps to raise the stature of women, especially overcoming what she did. And being such a person to have a regard for her fellow man. I mean, she could have just said, well, the heck with this. Oh, pity me. But no, that's not what she does. It's not what she does. And credit Ann Sullivan here for helping to put this together, too. I mean, you know, that was the clay, and she helped mold it. So, yeah. And so Helen Keller didn't do this on her own. She had help. I mean, let's understand this. Everybody has help to a certain extent. Everybody, even the one who says, I did this on my own. Oh, then maybe not.
She had the means, though, to have a personal nurse and teacher with her all the time.
Right, but then again, some of that money she's going to earn through the talks, even though she'll commit some of that money to things like the American Federation of the Blind.
She wouldn't have reached that stage to begin with.
Beg your pardon?
She wouldn't have reached that stage.
Oh, no.
To communicate
No.
to begin with.
Right. I mean, it does help to have the means. You know.
Disability would put someone like that in a closet and try to hide.
Well, yeah. But then again, like you say, putting somebody like that in a closet, when you are, as she was, as you are determined, and she has a will here, obviously. I mean, the response to that editor at the Brooklyn Eagle is testament to that. Having that determination and that will, yeah, she won't be, yeah, well, to a certain extent, yeah, feisty. But in a polite way, perhaps. You know? I mean, the language itself here, and that again, that shows the intelligence of this lady. The language itself, you know, in response, oh, ridiculous Brooklyn eagle, socially blind and deaf. I mean, she didn't, you know, she's using certain language to convey maybe her displeasure with this paper. She's not using stable language. That in turn shows a little education too, which is something the founding fathers would have done. Read your emails lately? Yeah. So in other words, what I'm telling you here is some of what she writes and the way she writes maybe should be written in English class. The proper use of English?
So she was well educated.
Right. Well, yeah. But you know, at the same time here, I mean, the way she writes could be used in an English class as an example of perhaps proper English. I mean, I know myself. I read a lot about I read a lot of the founding fathers, and that helped me with English writing. Or people like Winston Churchill, who I love to read. I mean, I love the history, but it's the use of the language here. I mean, who else would issue a declaration of war and sign it, your most obedient servant, Winston S. Churchill? But then again, you know, to the Japanese, and then when he's criticized for this, he says, well, when you have to kill a man, it costs you nothing to be polite. That gets you back to what we were just talking about. But again, it's this marvelous use of language that's really attractive. Yes?
Did she have open conflicts with Wilson or anyone in his administration, or was just her opinion that?
I didn't get into that her opposition to Wilson. It's just, but I do know she was an opponent of the war. She was an opponent of war. And I think she's understanding the realization of war here at this point. You know, you take a look. I mean, she sees this take a look at the Spanish-American War, and then take a look at the industrialization and commercialization of war, 1914, 1918. You know,
In Vietnam.
well, going on to that, but I mean, the industrialization of war, producing more weapons, and then the technology evolves. We're able to kill more people, which means you need more bodies now. And so that's a definite turnoff for some people, like her. And so, yeah, she sees this. And she'll see World War II, which is the same sort of thing, only this time on steroids. And then, yeah, Vietnam. And so, Korea, let's not forget that one. And so she sees this. And so, yeah, being a pacifist, vehement anti-war, for somebody like this, not hard to do. Let's talk our problems out instead of shooting them out. So, yes.
I think that her and someone buried in Washington D.C. both together.
The what?
They're buried together.
Yeah, she was cremated first,
You know,
and then buried with Ann Sullivan and Polly Thompson too. I think Polly Thompson too. But Winnie Corbally will be the last one with her.
Where is she buried?
In Washington.
Arlington or?
No, let's see. No, she's not buried in Arlington. Not buried there. Let's see here. Miss Honors. She's also had a lot of streets named after her in other countries, hospitals, so on and so forth. Let me see here. Okay. The National Cathedral in Washington had a service. Her body was cremated and her ashes were placed there next to her constant companions, Ann Sullivan, Polly Thompson, and she is buried at the Washington National Cathedral. So the three of them are buried together after she was cremated. So, interesting. Which would seem, I don't know, maybe that would seem that that's the way this lady should be buried, cremated. So, interesting. Yes?
You had mentioned she was very much concerned about nutrition, good health.
Yes.
Was that not something of the time? Because I'm trying to think, there was a Christian Science religion, I believe.
Yeah.
Eddie Parker or someone
Mm-hmm.
out of Minnesota or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very much health. We have to eat properly, and that's what God wants us to do. So we have to change. So graham crackers came out, and
Right.
cornflakes, I think it was, number of products, and there was a lot of interest at the time.
Well, she's thinking too here that, you know, as women elevate their status here, there were still women who, I mean, if they divorced their husbands, some of these women are left out in the cold, so what do they resort to? Prostitution, whatever the case may be. But again, she's concerned with things like syphilis leading to blindness because she's blind. And so she's very socially concerned there, but she was a firm believer in that nutrition would keep you healthy. Well, whether you're a man or a woman, it would keep you healthy. I mean, even today, I mean, what's the best way to not get sick? Eat right. Drink a lot of water, things like this. And so she's ahead of the curve here in that regard. But you know what's interesting here too, when you listen to somebody like a Helen Keller talking about this, and then you fast forward, it's around the same time anyway, Edward Bernays, who was the father of American propaganda, and who sold that fiction to the Americans, or helped sell that fiction to Americans that World War I was fought for democracy, will later be hired by Liggett Myers, L&M Cigarettes, remember them? Remember them? Yeah. He will be hired by them, and he will put forth a propaganda campaign in the 20s for Liggett Myers selling L&M cigarettes. Remember, women got the right to vote, 1920, right? Yeah. And so he's going to take advantage of that. And he was originally a publicist for some opera singers before World War I, one of them being Enrico Caruso. This guy was a nephew of Sigmund Freud. And so he will help sell the idea by using female opera singers, slender female opera singers, them smoking, and say, yeah, smoking's great for your throat. Oh yeah. And so you have somebody like a Helen Keller saying nutrition is the way to maintain great health, and then you got this guy who comes out selling cigarettes saying, gee whiz, you know, it's opera singers. Cigarettes are great for your throat. And then what's interesting here, to add insult to injury here, George Washington Hill of the American Tobacco Company sees Lucky Strike cigarette sales beginning to do this. So what does he do? He buys Bernays from Liggett Myers and brings them over to the American Tobacco Company. And now Bernays, still taking advantage of the thing about women and smoking, because they got the right to vote, now has to fashion a propaganda camp or a selling campaign, you know, to get them to buy Lucky Strike cigarettes. So maybe you've seen this. 1928, I think it was. There was this beautiful, slender woman in a slinky red dress with a cigarette between two fingers, looking up at nothing. And Bernays' catchphrase: "Cigarettes are torches of freedom."
Sounds like a poster by a movie.
Yeah. So here you got this lady saying nutrition is the key to good health, and then you got Bernays selling millions upon millions upon millions of Lucky Strike cigarettes. So yeah, interesting what you see in American society here. Fascinating. Fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
In terms of just the social issues, not the political issues, did she cross paths with Eleanor Roosevelt at all?
I didn't get into that. I honestly don't know. Could very well have been.
Overlapped in a lot of their speaking.
Could very well have been, but I didn't get into that. She could have. They could have. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt's going to be pretty good friends with Amelia Earhart. And Amelia Earhart was politically conscious too, because she supported the Equal Rights Amendment. Amelia Earhart's the one who told her husband, George Palmer Putnam, when they got married, "My name is not Eleanor Putnam, it's Amelia Earhart." So, yeah. And so again, another one of these women, but I honestly don't know if they really crossed paths or not. I didn't find that. They might have, but I didn't get into that at all. Yes, anybody else have any questions? Questions or comments? Yes.
I was wondering if she was ever questioned about her support for eugenics, because that's kind of horrifying.
That seems to go against the flow of her.
Yeah, she was also for birth control. She was also for birth control.
Right.
But keep in mind, eugenics was becoming fashionable then.
I do understand.
People
that.
becoming socially conscious, controlling the population. Maybe, you know, marginalizing, you know, again, health, eugenics, birth control, you know, but again, it's going to be the Nazis that are going to pollute that water.
Well, in some people's opinion, I mean.
Yeah. But
anyone
again,
doing it is kind of offensive to me.
well, I can understand that. I can understand that.
She got some perception from her mother. Her mother kept on, I don't know, her religion.
Well, that could be
Yeah,
too.
That's what I read.
That could be too.
And her mother was very fanatical. I don't think she was in a happy marriage.
Well, yeah, but I mean, as she develops into her own person, she's going to take a belief like that because, again, going to nutrition, maintaining good health, and maintaining a strong, viable population. You know. But then again, the Nazis will pollute that water. So.
So did she say anything publicly about it, or not really?
Not. I didn't dwell on that end of that with her. I stayed with the social activism for the most part because I thought that was important because it got the short shrift. But that in a way could be construed as being part of her social activism.
Right.
But I stayed with the fact that she was a big proponent for the blind people who are blind and deaf and her politics, more than getting into the eugenics end of this. I mean, that can be even a separate talk, eugenics. The people in this country who supported it.
Well, there was actually sterilization in this country.
Well, yeah, again, this state was one of the first to sterilize criminals, people who were considered mentally incompetent.
There's a famous case where the judge said 3 generations of imbeciles are too much, and he ordered the woman to be sterilized.
Yeah, Oliver Wendell Holmes was a proponent of this. Yeah. Right, yeah. And so, if I'm not mistaken, There was, was it Edwin Black who did a
Yeah.
research on
War
this?
against the weak.
Right, War Against the Weak. And I think if I'm not mistaken, between 1909 and 1960, or the early 60s, we sterilized upwards of 60,000 people in the state.
In Connecticut.
In Connecticut, yeah.
Yeah, they kept
Yeah,
going.
they had six centers, if my memory serves me correct. Middletown was one. Was Weathersfield another? I don't remember, but there were six. There were six centers.
There was a hospital there.
Right. And so, and we weren't the only ones. I mean, Virginia, Indiana, California, there were other states that did that. So when the Nazis were put on trial at Nuremberg, what do you think their defense is?
You did it.
Right. Right. What'd you think he did to the Indian? Again, it leads now to that, going back, that leads to that, the extermination of the Indian. So yeah, it was fashionable at this point to try, I keep in mind what's going on here too. Society is modernizing. The evolution of capitalism, the evolution of the Industrial Revolution. Societies are changing. They're no longer run by monarchs. People aren't tied to the land anymore. They're this growing clique of rich has displaced the nobility. Now you have a growing middle class. And these people aren't tied to the land anymore. They now got a few bucks in their pocket. Well, maybe now they're thinking differently about how society should be arranged. I mean, there's a lot going on here. Did you ever see that movie Metropolis? That silent movie Metropolis? That German movie?
Fritz Lang.
Yeah, Fritz Lang, about a society. Interesting what you see here with this. You have the rich and well-to-do, and then the mass working for them in these sweatshops, really, is what they are. And yet, go back to one of your founders, and who is it? Alexander Hamilton. All societies divide into the few and the many. And the few are the rich and the well-born, the mass. And he says to lead to the rich and the well-born a permanent position in ruling the country, as the mass is too tenuous, too unpredictable to do that.
Hamilton was of that belief?
Hamilton, yes. And yet at the same time, John Adams is saying, well, the wide ownership of private property is conducive to a functioning system of representative government.
Wow.
Yeah. And so when you look at somebody like Hamilton, then look at what Fritz Lang did with that movie, and then throw in people like a Helen Keller, who seem like they have a high regard for their fellow man, but then again, there's the bump in the road, perhaps, by what you're asking here. And you see there's a lot going on here. And so man is transforming himself from serfdom and feudalism into now a system, capitalism. Society's changing, and so now all these ideas are coming out. So how do we best live together? Well, maybe some of the people who maybe are a little sick or maybe a little weak, maybe we don't need them. There are people like that, still are like that today. Is she shaking her head? Yes. Yeah, they exist. So, but then again, you throw somebody in here like a Susan B. Anthony, who at one point, some of these abolitionists, yes, let's get rid of slavery, it's an abomination. Yeah, let's send the blacks back to Africa. No, we need to educate them like women. Equal opportunity. Lincoln was not on board with that.
He believed in many forms of abolishing slavery, including colonization, sending them off to their own colony, paid emancipation. He was conflicted in that before he came along.
Yeah, but in the beginning, he was interested in keeping the country together.
Yes.
Not so much interested in destroying slavery as an institution.
Right.
Of course, he's going to have to come around to that by 1862, 63. But in the beginning, he wasn't interested he was interested in keeping the country together, is what he was interested in doing. But then again, things like the Emancipation Proclamation are going to evolve here.
Yeah.
And what's interesting here too is, and then you throw Frederick Douglass into this, telling black men when the opportunity arises, don't be given your freedom, fight for it. So you're going to have upwards of 200,000 black men in blue uniforms.
Compensated emancipation was another idea that he had as a way out from that.
I mean, people are thinking how to solve this issue, which your founders kicked down the road. Of course, there's a reason for that too.
Well, the Declaration of Independence, it was brought up, but they had to pull it out, apparently, from something I read, because the South would never go for this declaration of war, against England, if slavery was an issue that was in that declaration.
Well, again, you're seeing when they're trying to put this together in 1776 that the North is going to have to capitulate on certain things and the South is going to have to capitulate on certain things. So you're going to have 56 signers from 13 colonies signing this document. And so there's a loose confederation here. And they will cement that confederation because at this time most of the army were guys from the North. Well, you think the Southerners are going to? No, so we'll apply a Southern commander to them. That's George Washington. Now we're off and running. So, rocky start here, but we're off and running. And so, when the war is over with, yeah, the South will be able to keep that agrarian economy underpinned by the slaves. And so we'll solve that problem later on, but we want to put the country together. And so does that...
Of course, there were no slaves up in the North.
Well...
It was just the Southerners, right?
Yeah,
Down
well,
there.
yeah. But then again, where were a lot of the slaves coming in?
Newport.
And New York City, places like this. So, interesting how this is. Yes?
It's my understanding that I heard someone say July 4th should be a day of sadness because if the Declaration was signed earlier, it would have eliminated slavery. But Virginia, I think it was, put up resistance, so it delayed the signing until it was changed to eliminate the word slavery.
Well, there were a number of drafts, but the final draft, yeah, there really is. Is there really a mention of slavery in the final draft? Not really. And so, and who's going to be considered the author of that? A Southerner, Thomas Jefferson. I mean, John Adams was involved in it, Ben Franklin, but it'll be Adams is the one who pushes Jefferson to be the final author of this because he thought Jefferson had the greatest talent among the founders with the English language, and that's no lie, probably did. But then again, you're talking about somebody like a Jefferson together with an Adams and a Franklin, people like this, different sections of the country. One has slavery, one still has slavery up in the north, but not to the extent it is down south. Putting this off to solve this problem because they want to kick the crown out of here and form a nation. So that can be kicked down the road. So they're not going to broach this thing known as slavery at this point because it'll be an impediment to the ultimate objective, getting rid of the crown and then forming this new entity, what they're eventually going to call the United States. So
it's not like all of a sudden in 1860 slavery became an issue. It was an issue way back to our infancy.
Well, it's an issue.
Buried,
it's an issue as we're expanding here. It becomes an issue because, okay, well, this state can become a free state, this state can become a slave state. And the Southerners were concerned, well, if they're going to stop us from getting Kansas as a slave state, they're eventually going to stop us from having slavery in Virginia or North Carolina, South Carolina. And so these radical elements in the 1850s are going to take this and run with it. And then they're going to try to have, which I call the Civil War, the revolt of the planters is really what that is. And it's interesting here because this Jeffersonian idea of the agrarian is going to be defeated in 1865, and the Hamiltonian idea of industrialization / finance will take over. And what happened to the country since? The Hamiltonian idea won out. Yes?
Why did so many Southerners fight, even though they didn't have slaves?
Well, it's most Southerners were not slave owners.
I know.
But the idea here is too. This is my land. Land is a big thing.
Was it a band of brothers type of feeling?
To a certain extent, but again, most of the Southern soldiers weren't the richest men in the world either, and they were fighting to protect the South from the North, and a lot of this was the land.
Could the U.S. government have paid off the South as far as here's money for your slaves and we'll stop it that way? You know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, but I don't think that was going to happen at this point. I think there were too many Southerners, especially the radicals, like Robert Barnwell Rhett, people like this, who were very, very adamant at the time. No, we got to secede, and they're going to do that. Yeah. They're going to leave, and Lincoln's going to have to fight a war to put it back together again. And you know what's going to happen after that.
Why did the South want to go into South America?
Which was a stretch. They weren't going to be able to do that.
But they intended to, right? They want,
Well, if you go, well, yeah, he just said it. He just said the magic word Cuba. In 1808, Thomas Jefferson will say, because that's under Spanish rule at this point, 1808, that it would be nice if we can use Cuba as a jump-off point for Republican government.
Another slave state.
Well, yeah, but he doesn't say that. He says Republican government. I mean, keep in mind, we were founded, according to the founders, as a republic. And so this is radical. I mean, people like Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, people like Franklin, they're radical for the time. Radical. And because they go against the established trend. What was the standard form of government for most major nations, or most major empires or nations?
Monarchies.
The monarchies, right? Well, now you got these upstarts. This is as radical in 1790 as Marxism-Leninism will be in 1917. Wow. You know, and again, both are products of what? This growing, this rapid decline, which will be a rapid decline of royalty. Interesting what you see develop, and they're ideas coming out of what? The Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment. And again, that gets us back to these ladies because of these ideas of liberalism, democracy, secularism, socialism, nationalism, parliamentarianism. I mean, some of these ladies are taking these ideas or rudiments of these ideas and now expanding the stature of women, raising the stature of women. Now, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. You know, if the man can have a right to vote, why can't a woman have the right to vote? Or why can't a woman have the right to nutrition?
Well, where is it? Egypt, they're finally getting to drive?
Saudi Arabia. Yeah, but you know what though? Yeah, they say they can drive, but unless the man of the house says you can have the keys to the car, guess what? These women aren't getting the keys to the car, so.
in Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
but there are other countries that are not as bad as Saudi Arabia.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No, but, you know, I mean, but again, the women in Saudi Arabia, boy, they got a lot of catching up to do.
Well, that sounds like Italy 50 years ago.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But again, you know, women too are just another segment of humanity who are, or many of them are fighting for their rights.
The interesting thing about this is when you look back at the last 200 years or so, you see the Native American, the African American, and women that at that point were not even seen as human beings, full human beings. I think they actually had percentages. Like
The Mexicans too, it was, you know, every ethnic group is considered.
No, I mean, but those, they actually had numbers on them. I think I think a Native American was like a half, considered half white.
Well, that's has to do with the taxation of the states and how they would pay the taxes.
Or
And the
represent.
slave owners had to pay taxes for their slaves, and they said, we can't afford this, so we can only, it wasn't that they were 3/4 of
Oh,
a
no.
human being.
But that's the that's Black Americans. But women also were not seen as full human beings. You know, they were property of their fathers, and then they were sold basically to a husband.
Right.
And you know, I think they were even less, if I'm not mistaken, than a black, an African American. And Native Americans were somewhere in that proportion, and then all of a sudden, within 200 years, you've got this whole
Right.
destruction of this whole system that's,
Right.
you know, not fully destroyed yet.
No.
In any one of those, you know, it's not fully destroyed, you know, it's still,
Yeah.
you know, battling, you know.
I
But
don't
it's a good start, I think, you know.
Well, yeah, but there's a long way to go.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that's it. We're done. You're welcome. Thank you for coming.
I still read something recently.